Hello and welcome to another episode of the Southbound Sports Podcast. I am your host, Richie Leahy. We got some exciting news coming up. First off, our site is in the process of being expanded. I think I mentioned it before. We talked a little bit about getting some sponsorships. Well, that's well underway. And we have been granted access to a couple media rooms. And basically what that means is that now we have access to some photos of some teams and some audio transcripts of some interviews and things that are going to help make this podcast better. I'm still waiting to hear back on some of the leagues before I mention which ones we have. So we have 2 different leagues right now and waiting to hear back on about 2 or 3 others. So I'm hoping that works out because that's the best way to bring better quality content to the listeners. So that's my quick update on that. Hopefully we can go ahead and expand on that. And with that, we've been looking to do a little bit more of a regional thing. We have some shows going up. We're going to be expanding here instead of just doing this short national show, which may expand soon in the future. We're going to be focusing on a couple different sports, and those are things that are going to be coming down the pipe. But today we're going to talk about basically 2 different topics. The first thing is one of my favorites things to talk about in recent years, and that is college football expansion. Basically, conference expansion, if we're boiling down to it. What teams are going to make the cut here, as it seems more inevitable that some teams are going to be in this upper playoff tier, and then some other teams aren't going to be able to make that cut. There's going to be a division here soon, playoffs teams and conferences and non-playoff teams and conferences. Now, there is no argument that the number one prize for any conference is going to be Notre Dame. The reasoning behind that is they are one of the top schools in terms of football wins and football winning percentage. And, as a double bonus, they've never actually been a part of a conference. And what I mean by that is they don't have this own model of what they can bring. Their school alone has a contract with NBC, I believe, for about $15 million a year. Actually, yeah, I know it is on NBC. The price is what I'm not sure on. But it's around that for one school to broadcast their home football games. Now, to put that in perspective, most of these other contracts are for a conference base. Now, years ago, this gave Notre Dame an edge, and this is why they stayed independent. Now, are they going to join a conference? I don't think so, to be honest. I think they're stringing the ACC along, and I'll get into that here in a bit. But in terms of this, when they're talking about splitting up football and why this realignment is going to happen, it's going to happen because there's basically what the consensus is, there's going to be 4 final conferences. There just has to be. It makes sense in terms of playoffs. And each conference can go ahead, and probably what's going to happen is they're going to name their own champion. And that champion then is going to be in a 14 playoff, if it stays the same way. Now, there have been some proponents that go ahead and say that let's just expand the playoffs to 8 teams. If that happens where it's the 5 conference champions and 3 at-large teams, then you might not see the split. But for right now, we're going to go with it as it is, 14 playoff. It makes sense that there's going to be 4 conferences left standing, and their champions get the automatic bids. It plays out that way, except for last year with Ohio State getting the nod over Penn State. Everyone saw how big of a mistake that ended up being as Ohio State got shut out in the playoffs. I don't see that happening again. The only way that happens again is if both teams make it from the same conference, which is a possibility because that could happen. Now, onto it, the bigger players. The biggest player actually is the Big Ten, and they're pretty much neck and neck with the SEC. The Big Ten has 4 schools right now that are basically in the top football echelon of all time. They have Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Nebraska. So that goes ahead and puts them in a top tier. The only conference that can match them, team for team, is the SEC. And this is all time. In recent years, the edge goes to the SEC. The SEC has been more powerful, has more champions, has everything. Right now, so their top schools are going to be Alabama, Florida, possibly Tennessee. If you're getting into it, LSU. You could throw Auburn in there. Maybe for Tennessee hasn't been that good in recent years, but historically they have 4 or 5 teams that are going to be top dogs. They can compete and end up in a national championship. The Big Ten, they have their own second tier that can do that with Michigan State. They made a playoff. Wisconsin, they've been close. I mean, Iowa had an undefeated year a few years ago. They got steamrolled in their bowl game, but they're still there. So Big Ten has other teams, and the SEC has other teams that can jump up and play in the mix. South Carolina had a good run a few years ago. Missouri, even with Texas A&M now, they've had some good runs. So it puts those 2 conferences, they have the depth that the other conferences don't have. And that's why they play head-to-head in most bowl games. And so if you look at the payouts, just based on bowl games, the Big Ten and the SEC are head and shoulders above everyone else. They have the largest fan bases, and they draw the most viewers. So it's very cut and dry which conferences are the best. And now what you're looking at is what are going to be the other 2 conferences. It makes sense that the Pac-12 is going to be one of the 4 because they are on the West Coast. They pretty much have a monopoly on the West Coast. I highly doubt that the playoffs are going to go ahead and start and leave off West Coast schools like USC, UCLA, Oregon. And just based on proximity, they're not going to jump conferences and join. The only way I would see is if there ended up being some mega conference where the Pac-12 and the Big Ten join, with the Rose Bowl sending their winner to the national championship. So basically making up a half of the 14 playoff. Basically their winner of the Big Ten and the Pac-12 play. And it's basically one big super conference where they only play each other and maybe one other non-conference school. But I just don't see that happening. In the past, I thought that might be an option before they had the playoffs. I thought that was what was going to happen. I thought the Big Ten and the Pac-12, they already have a scheduling agreement. They go ahead and they name their own champion in the Rose Bowl. They play it New Year's Day, and then the national championship's usually the week after. And then that team would get an automatic bid. So you're going to have the big matchups, Michigan, USC. You're going to see Oregon, Ohio State. You're going to see Penn State get in there, maybe Stanford. And the winner of that was going to go to the national championship game. But when the playoff was announced, because people had said there would never be a playoff, and that made the most sense to me, the winner of that big super conference would play against the rest of them all. And just because of money. Pac-12 has their own network, so does the Big Ten, and so does the SEC. They're the only 3 conferences that have that, and I think that goes ahead and gives them a slight nod into who is going to be left standing after all this falls down. So that leaves 2, the ACC and the Big 12. A few years ago, I would have said the ACC was done. And now you have Florida State winning a national championship, Clemson winning a national championship. The Tar Heels, they're looking to get probably hammered by the NCAA. If not, then the whole thing's a joke. I've even seen Florida State coming out now and saying that if UNC doesn't lose their wins in their national championships, that Bobby Bowden needs to get his back. So there's going to be backlash if they don't get hammered. But either way, they just won the national championship. You also have them and Duke. And make no mistake about it, this whole realignment is due to football. Basketball plays no part in it. The basketball ratings, even for the NBA, are less than what people get for college football games. College football has higher ratings. It's like the second highest rated sport in the United States. So it's pretty cut and dry on what happens. And so that's what you're looking at overall in terms of why this expansion is going to happen and this realignment is going to happen. It's going to come down to football, and that's pretty much it. Nothing else. There's no other driver in this. Olympic sports don't really matter in terms of money. If they want to pay players, they have to make that money on football. You can go ahead and sell out the big house, Michigan, Ohio. They have over 100,000. Ohio Stadium. Then you have Beaver Stadium, over 100,000. Alabama, Texas, all these giant stadiums. That's what gets the money. People in the seats, people watching on TV. The monstrosity TV contracts are due to football. It looks like I'm running hot on this, so this is probably going to end up being our only topic of the week podcast. But it comes out, it's leaked by Tim Brando to some Louisville paper or something that he thinks that Notre Dame is going to join the ACC, which pretty much goes ahead and it cuts down. It cuts down the conferences because if Notre Dame joins the ACC, then that's it. ACC is the 4th conference. Probably the Big 12 is looking to break up. If the ACC could somehow lure Notre Dame and Texas, that would go ahead and put them on the tier with the Big Ten and the SEC. And then you'll have basically a Big Three ratings conferences and everything. Basketball, football, they're going to be mashing it out because there's no way you can beat Texas and Notre Dame. They're going to pick up all those other schools because up to this point in football, the ACC is basically Florida State and Clemson. That's pretty much it. Maybe Virginia Tech, but those schools, their ratings pale in comparison to the Big Ten and SEC schools. So, they need to play. That Notre Dame, Florida State game wasn't rated as high as what Ohio State and Michigan was. Michigan and Ohio State, they played in the highest rated game last year. You know what else comes up there? Auburn and Alabama. Big rivalry games. The ACC doesn't have that. Florida State can play Clemson. They get mediocre results. I'm pretty sure a Notre Dame-Michigan State matchup would beat that. But I don't think the Notre Dame's going to join the Big Ten. It makes the most sense geographically, and they did just join for hockey, but I don't see them joining. Unless they have to. Unless there are 4 conferences and you have to be in a conference winner to make the playoffs, that's the only way they join. And the only way I think that happens is if Notre Dame does join the ACC. Now, who would be their last travel mate? To be honest, the best team location-wise is going to be West Virginia. I just don't know. ACC can't use academics against them anymore if they let in Louisville. It just doesn't make sense. It makes them look like fools if that's their argument. Fool's gold out there. Throwing that as their main argument out to people as why they can't be in. So, I think that Notre Dame's not going to join. I think they're stringing them along. The Big East, Notre Dame strung them along and basically destroyed their conference. That's why whenever I would originally said that the conference that most likely to fall apart is going to be the ACC. And it would come down to who the SEC and the Big Ten want. And that's pretty much what's going to happen. If Notre Dame doesn't join, who's to say that the Big Ten doesn't add Virginia and North Carolina as their 15 and 16 schools? And then the SEC, they're battling out. What if they add North Carolina and Virginia to strengthen their SEC location? Because they want those extra states in because they have so many millions of people. So if Virginia and North Carolina are the prizes, and they could be up for grabs for the SEC or the Big Ten, the ACC might not survive. But if Notre Dame can keep them coming along, they want them to survive. They keep telling North Carolina, hey, we'll play you guys every couple years. We'll play in your division eventually. Lure Texas here. Because if Texas has their own network and they can come in and tell the ACC with Notre Dame that they want to keep their money, then it won't be equal revenue sharing. That's what those two schools want. They don't want equal revenue sharing because they know that they can draw more money off football than those other schools in the ACC can. But print them all together, maybe you could throw together a package that makes sense. I don't think the SEC, they probably want Texas, but I feel like it's not going to happen with A&M there. They lure them in. A&M's been a great exposure boom to them. Bringing in Texas will bring in a lot of bad blood, and that's not what the SEC is about. They're more about being one whole conference, chanting SEC, SEC at every event. I don't see Texas doing that. I don't see Notre Dame doing that. So realistically, the only option for those two schools are going to be the ACC and the Big Ten. Texas could go to the Pac-12, and that's what the consensus was a few years ago, was that Texas, Oklahoma, maybe Texas Tech, and Oklahoma State would all go to the Pac-12. And then the rest of the schools would kind of be picked up by whoever. And that was it. Those are going to be the 4 conferences. Texas and Oklahoma in the Pac-12 strengthens that football so big that now they're on the same tier as the Big Ten and the SEC. But for whatever reason, it didn't happen. But I'm saying right now, and I'm going to put some thought into this, and I'll probably post something on the site. But for right now, for this week's episode, I'm saying Notre Dame does not join a conference. They just don't. It doesn't make sense to them. They have the power in their hands. They're not going to rush to join the ACC. The ACC doesn't have a network. If they get one later on down the road, Notre Dame could possibly join, but who's going to be that 16th team? I don't think Notre Dame joins if it's UConn. It doesn't make sense for them to go ahead and make concessions only to make that 16th team be UConn. If they can lure Texas, yeah, I could see them joining with some provisions that say that them and Texas can go ahead and do some type of negotiation for their own third-tier rights or something and make all their own money, which they would make more than the other schools in the ACC. But that's it. I've seen that floating around, and it got me going because it's something that interests me. As a Michigan man, I see that the Big Ten's in a pretty good spot. The SEC is in a pretty good spot. The other conferences I don't know and how it's going to shake out. But I would like to see Notre Dame join the Big Ten just to keep that rivalry going. I was at the Under the Lights game at the Big House. We beat Notre Dame. Huge, huge game. Big environment, everything. And to me, if Notre Dame goes and joins the ACC, they don't have that environment, and that's what their football team is built on. That is what gets crowds going. Not playing home and home with Wake Forest. It's not going to happen. I just don't see it happening. Maybe the Big Ten, but even then, who do you put them in a division with? Maybe they could go ahead. There's been rumors that Oklahoma's been looking, and they've been talking to the Big Ten. If Oklahoma and Texas come to the Big Ten, then yeah, Notre Dame will probably want to join. I've been hearing rumors that the Big Ten wants to go to 18. To me, that doesn't make sense because the old consensus was that it was going to be 16 with 14 pods. And I'll draw that up. I'll put it all out there. And as I hear more, I'll let everyone know. But that's it for this week's podcast. We're getting into the summer months. Like I said, be ready. Thanks for staying with us. Tell your friends. If you have any idea for content, please let me know. Follow us, Southbound Sports. Like our page on Facebook. It's S-Bound Sports on Twitter. Southbound Sports on Instagram. We didn't have enough space on Twitter. But follow us. Like our page. Tell your friends. Get some people out there. If you want to call into the show, I'm working on getting that set up. I'm working on getting some other segments set up and some other shows. The ETA, honestly, is probably going to be around football season. But the show's going to keep going every Wednesday, all summer. And I'll keep you up to date. Anything I hear, I'll let you know. But thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Southbound Sports Podcast, and I'm your host, Richie Leahy.